Have you or a loved one fallen deeply in love with the Mandalorian and his gremlin child? But you're starting to get a little confused after season 2 as to who, what, and where is going on. Well, I hate to tell you this, but season 3 is most likely going to be even more confusing if you're not familiar with the greater Star Wars universe. Luckily, I, Alex Gaster, also known as Fear My Paintbrush, am here to assist you with everything you need to know about Star Wars before you watch The Mandalorian Season 3 for your ideal watching experience. First off, major spoilers for the Book of Boba Fett, minor but still nonetheless significant spoilers for Star Wars The Clone Wars, the animated series, multiple seasons and multiple episodes, Star Wars Rebels, same deal, and for the first 2 trilogies of the Skywalker saga, although any Star Wars is going to be a spoiler for the Skywalker saga, basically. But that's besides the point. Now, to start off, let's recap Book of Boba Fett, which is arguably meant as an in-between to The Mandalorian. I highly recommend that you watch Book of Boba Fett before Mandalorian, but considering that we're about 3 hours away from the launch of the season, and I'm assuming you haven't watched it still, this is the time to get a brief recap. And I'm going to do it trying my best not to spoil some of the actual Boba Fett parts of the series, and instead focusing more on the Mandalorian parts of it. First off, you're gonna wonder, why is the baby back? Didn't the baby go with Luke Skywalker? Well, Luke tried to train Grogu, but Din wanted to say hi and gave Grogu a gift, essentially. And Luke decided, because we have to stick with what happened in the sequels, to essentially tell Grogu you are either a Jedi and you are going to take up Yoda's old saber and be a Jedi with no attachments, or you can take your father's gift and return back to him. Obviously, because Disney can't exactly lose their toy-making brilliant little baby boy, he goes back to Mando and has R2 drop him off on Tatooine, where he promptly befriends Boba's new Rancor and takes the little Beskar chainmail that Din had given him as well. Now, that's not to say that his time with Luke was pointless. He did get a bunch of power upgrades and is way more mobile than he was before, which is going to be interesting to see how Din handles this in Season 3. Now, the other thing you're going to notice that's distinctively missing from Din is his spear, and you're probably going to wonder what happened to the iconic weapon. Well, Din manages to find the remains of his covert, including the armorer, who promptly tells him that while the spear was useful in saving his child and earning the Darksaber, weapons made of Beskar aren't allowed in our creed. Beskar is only meant for armor, and so Din has the Beskar spear forged down into the chainmail that Din will eventually give to Grogu, that Luke offers him as the way to basically say you're leaving the Jedi Order. Now, one more thing that Din got during that weird episode of Book of Boba Fett that had nothing to do with Boba Fett, and that's a very familiar ship. Basically, after the Razor Crest exploded, Din was like, hey, I need another ship, Peli, can you help me out? And she ends up deciding to get him an old Naboo starfighter with the old droid area hollowed out, which is conveniently Grogu-sized. Now, how Din is going to carry around bounties with this, we don't know, but we can assume that this is an evolution from his time as a bounty hunter into something a little bit more special. Nonetheless, there was a fantastic scene with him first flying this ship, so if you get a chance to watch the Book of Boba Fett to watch this, if you're a fan of the series, you will notice 1.5 million Easter eggs, and it's absolutely fantastic. Now, as for why Din was such a crucial part of Book of Boba Fett, despite it being called Book of Boba Fett, well, it basically boils down to this. Without any spoilers, as best as I can, Fennec basically asks Din to help Boba fight some problems on Tatooine, and it's during this fight that Din reunites with Grogu, because of course the child is going to wander into a firefight in the middle of it. That being said, look at these awesome action shots. Go watch Book of Boba Fett. It's absolutely fantastic. Alright, Book of Boba Fett recap set aside, there's a couple of important people, groups, things, and general history that you're going to need to know about Mandalorians and about certain groups of Mandalorians if you're going to understand the full breadth of the situation that's going to be occurring during Season 3. The first one on this list is Bo-Katan Kryze, which you've already met during Season 2. She first appeared in the animated series as a higher-ranking member of the terrorist group Death Watch, and she was the sister to Sistine Kryze, who was the leader of the New Mandalorians, which were a faction of extreme pacifists who were the antithesis of what we think of as a Mandalorian, saying that armor wasn't allowed, fighting wasn't allowed, essentially trying to be as, well, pacifistic as possible to an extreme that would eventually lead to their downfall. She worked alongside Obi-Wan Kenobi, aiding his escape from Mandalore after a Maul-controlled Death Watch kills Satine and attempts to kill Obi-Wan too. She also helps Ahsoka Tano in the Siege of Mandalore at the end of the Clone Wars in an attempt to free Mandalore from the control of Maul and the Death Watch cronies who followed him after he gains control of the group. She was given the Darksaber by Sabine Wren about a decade before the events of The New Hope, and attempted to rally Mandalore together, but ultimately failed in the culmination of events that I will explain a little bit later on in the PowerPoint. Now, Death Watch. You really need to know a lot about Death Watch. Well, sort of, in order to truly understand the grasp of everything Din and Bo-Katan are dealing with. We mentioned that Bo-Katan was a former member of Death Watch, but it's also important to note that Death Watch was an extremist group that many people considered to be terrorists, led by Pre Vizsla until his death at the hands of Maul. Subsequently, during this point, Death Watch kind of splintered and fractured into multiple groups. Bo-Katan Kryze would eventually take over with what she called the Night Owls, who were a splinter that worked against Death Watch in an attempt to free Mandalore from what she considered a unworthy non-Mandalorian ruler, Maul, and another splinter group that stayed on the moon Concord Dawn would eventually come to call themselves the Children of the Watch, and they are the folks who would rescue Din and raise him as a child. Now we gotta talk about the Night of a Thousand Tears, which is unfortunately the culmination of Bo-Katan Kryze's rule as Mandalore. When she gained control of the Darksaber, she was essentially given the role of leader of the Mandalorians, and she chose to, quite understandably, use her rule to rally Mandalore together to fight against the Empire. Unfortunately, when the Empire saw that the Mandalorians were not going to be as easily controlled as they thought, they decided that if they couldn't have Mandalore, nobody could, and proceeded to do what is called glassing a planet, which is an orbital bombing so severe and so intense that the surface of the planet quite literally turns to sand, and then the heat of it turns that sand into glass, making the planet almost entirely inhabitable. You also have to understand that this isn't the first orbital bombing that Mandalore has gone through. While this material is now considered extended universe legends, we do see remains and examples of why this is still considered to be true throughout the Clone Wars animated series, which is to say, the use of biodomes, which is a remnant of the fact that the majority of the air and atmosphere and environment on Mandalore was already rendered mostly inhabitable by previous bombings back in the Mandalorian Conqueror days during the Mandalorian Jedi Wars. The Night of a Thousand Tears meant that Mandalorians as a creed, as a people, and as a culture was almost completely extinct, with very, very few factions remaining, many of which were on the extreme side, even more extreme than being terrorists. They were extreme in the way that they practiced the Mandalorian creed, which is how you get Children of the Watch and the way that they treat themselves, their armor, and their people. As sad as that all is, it is an important thing to note because it seems to be mentioned quite frequently both during Mandalorian Season 2 and in the trailer. Now, there's one more thing you're really going to need to know, and you probably already know a bit about it based on the explanations given at the end of Season 2. And that's the Darksaber. Now, I'm going to solely focus on what is canon about the Darksaber, although even in Legends, the story goes a bit wishy-washy. What we do know, and what has been confirmed by Disney as canon, is that it was forged by a Mandalorian Jedi named Tare Vizsla about 1,000 years ago. The timeline of the saber is a bit unclear. Now, note when I say 1,000 years ago, I'm talking 1,000 years before the events of the Battle of Yavin. So, about 1,100 years before A New Hope, roughly, but again, the timeline is a bit wishy-washy. Maul kills Pre Vizsla, who basically has the saber either from passing down or from taking it from somewhere around the second year of the Clone Wars. When Maul takes the Darksaber, he takes the leadership of the people Pre was leading, mostly Death Watch, but a bunch of other Mandalorians see that Maul carries the saber and chooses to bow down to his rule. Of course, at the end of the Clone Wars, Maul is defeated by Ahsoka Tano, or at the very least concedes defeat by running away. However, it's noted that he doesn't have the Darksaber during this fight. That's because he left it at a secret cache somewhere. During the time of the rebellion, about a decade before A New Hope, the Ghost Crew finds Maul's old hideout, which includes the Darksaber. Kanan, who was a former Jedi, taught Sabine Wren, a Mandalorian on the crew of the Ghost, to wield the Darksaber, teaching her how to fight with a blade that is almost practically weightless. However, after multiple battles and conflicts, Sabine eventually gives the saber to Bo-Katan, and this is where we get a little bit tricky. Now, traditionally, the passing of the saber has to be done through combat. Obviously, there wasn't really a combat in order to give it to Sabine, but she did manage to fight with it and keep it multiple times, facing up against members of the Empire, as well as Kanan as he taught her to wield it. Sabine, when she gives the saber to Bo-Katan, already breaks a crucial rule of just gifting the saber, but it's kind of stings a little bit more when, as evidenced by in Mandalorian Season 1, clearly Bo-Katan doesn't have the Darksaber. Moff Gideon did. It's also important to note that, remember that Night of 1,000 Tears I was talking about? Yeah, Moff Gideon was one of the main members of the Empire who oversaw the bombing. It's why it rubs a lot of salt into the wound for both Din and Bo-Katan to have to face him and deal with him during their time throughout the seasons. When Bo-Katan loses the saber, she also loses a lot of the faith of the Mandalorian people, because clearly her ability to rule is not strong, and many people, as the armorer references during the Book of Boba Fett, has to deal with the fact that she was given the saber and never actually won it. It was why she was so insistent to Din that she be the one to fight Gideon and not him. She wanted to win the saber because whoever wields it can rule all of Mandalore. Now, the Darksaber is a crucial part, and it is also important to note that Din did have to fight members of his covert, including Paz Vizsla, note the last name, in order to keep a hold of the Darksaber. In the end, he did win the Darksaber, but the armorer declared him no longer Mandalorian for having removed his helmet multiple times, as evidenced during Mando Season 2. Now, it is very much possible that during Season 3, we are going to get a lot of talk about what it means to be a Mandalorian and Din's personal journey to reclaiming his own personal belief as a Mandalorian. Now, for context, we also have to remember that Bo-Katan Kryze is like quite literally she's pretty old. She's broken the curse of you pass 50, you become an old hermit. That seems to happen in Star Wars all the time, thankfully. But she is a couple decades older than Din. You have to remember that Din was a child during the bombing and the siege of Mandalore, as well as basically still a child when the Night of 1,000 Tears happened. Bo-Katan, however, is a full-grown adult and knows exactly what she's doing by guilt-tripping Din in the trailer. I'm watching you. Now, hopefully that covers just about everything that you're going to need to know about the Mandalorian, about Mandalorians, and about the little bits and details that may be important for your watching of The Mandalorian Season 3, which, as of recording this, is coming out in about 3 hours. I hope y'all enjoyed, and if you want to see more nerdy content like this, either subscribe to the YouTube channel or check me out over on Twitch, where I not only made this presentation live, but recorded the presenting of it as well. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this fantastic year of Star Wars content. Oh yeah, Mandalore.